Welcome to another episode of the 1 Year No Beer podcast. I am Rory Fairbairns. Today I am joined by a very special guest. I discovered James deep into the science and research behind controlled drinking. Now, this is an interesting aspect because I was looking through what is a really interesting debate online in the scientific community about the brain disease model and things like that. And I discovered these researchers who were researching specifically around controlled drinking. In fact, some books published. I'm not going to give it all away, but this was really, really important that actually the science was out there showing us a very similar thing, that abstinence often gets in the way of people seeking support. Abstinence can be a barrier to good support, and total abstinence can, in some circumstances, make our relationship with alcohol worse. Now, this is all very dependent. Obviously, if you're, very subjective, rather. If you're alcohol-free and smashing and loving it, brilliant, well done. We're talking about helping wider communities, wider people, different people who might associate that or might not want that. And so it's about helping people to make that decision to change earlier, which I think is really powerful. So today I'm joined by James Morris. He's a research fellow at London South Bank Universities. He's been a specialty of research in alcohol harm reduction, addiction treatment, stigma, psychology, strategy, public health, social enterprise, community safety. This guy has been in and around it for many years. And what I particularly love is the work that he's doing around the controlled drinking. So if you are currently alcohol-free and enjoying it, don't worry, this podcast is not going to suddenly convince you that controlled drinking is better. It's just talking about helping a wider audience. Not all of the existing programs with their abstinence-only focus is the right way, and that we need to have a smorgasbord attack to help more people. So I hope you enjoy the lessons and the information and the research inside this podcast episode. Without further ado, let's welcome to the show, James Morris. Welcome to the podcast, James. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, James, after that very insightful background into who you are in a bit, let's start right from the top, which is really, how did you become interested in researching addiction and substance use disorders?
Sure, so it's fairly long story, but I'll try and be concise. Originally, I became interested particularly in kind of drinking behaviours as a result of my own experience as an undergraduate. So I was a teenager in the 1990s, which has kind of been described as peak booze, the period leading up to 2004, where consumption continued on that steep rise. And so by 14, I was doing alcohol pops in parks and binge drinking, if you like. But by the time I got to university, I'd developed a fairly significant degree of tolerance, and getting drunk, which was something, I'd regularly pursued, became increasingly difficult as a result of that tolerance, to the point that I actually developed physical health problems. So mainly alcohol-related gastritis, where my heavy drinking kind of dissolved the stomach lining, resulting in some unpleasant side effects. But of course, there was a lot of behavioural consequences, which at the time, I didn't really question, or many of them I was kind of proud of, or other people glamorised or saw me as in a positive light, which certainly things that I view less positively now. But really it was the kind of onset of the physical health problems that really were a wake-up call. So in my second year of university as an undergraduate, I tried to moderate my drinking and failed, not surprisingly, given my kind of peer social network and kind of, other factors involved in terms of like mental health and so on. And then, after...
Factors that are obvious to you now, but clearly were not at the time.
No, absolutely, Kind of, I often refer back to sort of the thought processes that I had then, and how much discrepancy there is between, some of the beliefs and expectations I had around drinking and other things, which we may come back to. I went through this period of trying to moderate my drinking and failing, and then I stopped drinking, and then that was a real eye-opener, because a lot of people were very uncomfortable with that and found it challenging, again, particularly because my social network was geared around heavy drinking. And then I ended up not drinking for 8 years. So when I graduated, I kind of got a job in kind of strategic related role relating to alcohol harm reduction, and then moved more into the health and public health and addiction treatment side of things before later coming to academia. But yeah, around 28 years old, I sort of began an experiment of trying to drink again in a kind of controlled or moderate way, which of course for some people was quite baffling, really. I had one person say, "You're going to deliberately relapse," but it was quite clear for me that I was going to, if it didn't work, if it, had some quite clear rules and parameters, which is a really important component of success in moderate drinking, that if I didn't achieve those or stick to those, then I'd return to abstinence, having learned how to do that and be happy with it. So yeah, now I kind of drink moderately. I enjoy a glass of wine with a meal, or a drink or two on a social occasion, but I'm quite strict about alcohol-free days in the week and how much I do drink when I do. So yeah, that's a bit of a summary.
Yeah, can you quantify that for me at the moment?
How much? Yeah, so at the start I was very strict about it, and it would, be literally within the recommended guidelines, which at the time were daily guidelines. So 3 to 4 units a day, which is like 1 or 1.5 of most drinks. And now we're back to kind of weekly guidelines, which is 14 units. So yeah, on an average week, I'd probably be around that mark when, so if I have a glass of wine or two with a meal once or twice a week, and then one social occasion, certainly, there used to be an upper threshold for men of 21 units a week. That's certainly something I'd never go above. But yeah, obviously it's a risk curve, and a lot of my work's about promoting this idea that it's not a steep cutoff. Like if you go above the guidelines, suddenly everything's going to go wrong.
Worse.
Yeah, it's a very strong dose effect, and the more you go above that, the greater the level of risks. But yeah, alcohol-free days and not being intoxicated or developing tolerance are clear boundaries for me.
Yeah. Okay, so for the first thing to really nail home here, one is that you had a pretty severe relationship with alcohol. Could you quantify what that was like in volume? What would you say you were doing units worse in your worst times? But not just like one peak, regularly. What were you in your? I think it did build up, but I suppose the really interesting thing was that I knew that going to university was an opportunity for lots of heavy drinking, particularly in my first year, where I don't think, doing my undergrad in history, there was any actual assessment that would count towards my final kind of degree. So the first year, it kind of really was, I was probably binge drinking heavily, easily 30 units on an occasion, 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week, with quite severe hangovers as a result of most of those sessions. But yeah, I remember having to drink or having to do lots of shots before I'd go out to have a chance of being intoxicated. So I'd probably do 6 shots and then go out and maybe drink 5 or 6 beers and then some double shots and so on. So yeah, the tolerance really went up, and I'd have to drink more and more. And even by the end, I still felt like I couldn't really get very drunk drinking those amounts. Yeah. Okay, well, I think the first part to notice here, this podcast, it is about you, but it's not about you. It's about the wonderful work that you are doing and the research that you are discovering. So we're not going to get into the tit for tat for whether you were an addict or an alcoholic or severe alcohol use disorder or all of those terms, right? It's not about painting the specific picture to say that you were the success story here to hold up the flag. But at 100 plus units a week, that's a huge volume of alcohol, and as you know now, very severe, damage and things like that. But that's also a lot of people in their 20s and 30s. I was there. I could, IP week, you'd be doing that in 3 days, 4 days, right? And oil week, you'd just be drinking all day, all night, couple of hours sleep in the disabled toilets. So one of the main points I wanted to bring you onto this podcast and obviously to highlight the wonderful work that you are doing, but is really the fascinating stuff around controlled drinking and the various reviews that you've done there. And what we have seen a lot of in our audience is that since we provide programs for people at all levels, right, almost all of our programs recommend a period of abstinence, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But is this feeling from those who maybe have tried to moderate or control their drinking in the past, who tell everyone that moderation is impossible. And those voices are very loud. We're going to come on to that. I'm sorry, I digress. That's the ADHD-ness in me, and we will shoot all over the place because I know that you want to help me communicate that better and tackle that. We'll come on to that. But what you said back in the beginning was beliefs versus expectations. And this was the beliefs that you had about the idea of trying to moderate your drinking with your own thinking hat on versus the expectation of reality. Give me a bit more insight into that from your perspective, both the beliefs that you had and why they come about, where they're from, and then the truth, the expectations, etc.
Yeah, so, I mean, in psychology, which is, kind of my main domain of research, there's a very strong literature that, a lot of our behaviours are driven by expectations or expectancies, as we'd call it. And expectancies are just, essentially just beliefs that we have about certain behaviours. If I drink, I will feel this way. But obviously, so many of these expectancies or beliefs are culturally conditioned. That's why the alcohol industry invests huge amounts in alcohol advertising that maybe portrays alcohol in certain ways. Although I probably need to be careful about what I say because they do have standards around advertising, which I would also point out are self-regulated, self-set. But essentially,
don't be careful what you have to say on this podcast. This is about straight talk on here.
Yeah, well, I never really quite understand the rules.
If they don't like it, they can come and get me.
Yeah, I never quite understand what the rules are around the legalities of it. But I think we can get away with saying, alcohol is, remains culturally normalised and very glamorised in a lot of ways. And, that's not necessarily an accident. And I think we're turning back the tide on that. We're fighting against that in some way. We are seeing gains in terms of consumption reducing and more people, particularly younger people, drinking less because in part they recognise that, the downsides of, are significant costs. There's significant costs to kind of drinking, at any level, essentially. But I certainly just grew up where, alcohol was a way of socialising, of letting go, of having fun, of and I guess, there is always the individual aspect to it. So certainly, as a child, I was actually quite shy and, within a shell. And as a teenager, I really sort of went the other way. And I think alcohol was a big part of maybe initially helping me to do that. But it's certainly true that a lot of the expectancies we have around drinking are just that. They're just belief effects that are partly rooted in a degree of the sort of pharmacological reaction of alcohol, but become more just a product of our beliefs. So lots of people, if you give them alcohol-free drinks and don't tell them, they'll report being just as drunk as someone that received an actual alcoholic drink. So I think, my whole belief system became embedded in this idea that drinking was a part of who I was. It was a part of my identity. It was a part of how I enjoyed myself and what I did to enjoy myself. And so at that point, my teens, I became very quickly embedded in this belief that, I just couldn't be me, or I couldn't be happy, or I couldn't have fun without drinking. And so, that process of kind of getting to a place where I could control my drinking or not overvalue drinking was a lot in larger process of realigning or scrapping those expectancies and starting again and sort of building alcohol into my life in a way that it wasn't, as Adrian Charles often says, put on such a huge pedestal. Yeah. Whereas now I just see a drink as a way to complement a meal or a social occasion, but I'm definitely not seeing it as something that is a part of who I am, or is as a necessity for having a good time or letting myself go or dealing with internalized emotional issues, or etc., etc. So yeah, now I would drink to complement an occasion or a meal, but I'm definitely not seeing it as part of my identity, part of a necessity to have fun, or as a way of dealing with issues that maybe I haven't addressed. So yeah, it's really just something that I could really take or leave, rather than something that really felt so fundamental to who I was and how I'd kind of express myself or have a good time as I saw it.
Okay. And so have you done periods of abstinence?
Well, I did 8 years in my 20s, and then since then, yeah, I've had probably a couple of weeks where I haven't drank for different reasons. But I often sort of think about dry January, but then a big part of what I kind of promote is, so I do that. It's about what you do most of the time, and moderation throughout the year. If you're a moderate drinker, is important. One of the criticisms about sort of abstinence or month off approaches is, if there's definitely benefits of doing that in terms of reduced kind of growth in cancer risk cells or liver functioning. But what if you return to your previous patterns of consumption? Does that make any difference? We don't really know.
Yeah. Okay. So at the moment you're sort of drink around the normal drinking. I say normal, but what 14 units is. That's where
the recommended guidelines.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm just challenging you on this because Professor Dame Sally Davis.
Yes.
Or Dame Sally Davis, not Professor. Dame Sally Davis, when she came out and changed that limit from 21 to 14, she said there's no safe limit. And you'll know from your research now, even a small amount of alcohol is significantly impacting your health, your mental health, things like that. So, yeah, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly say that from a physical health point of view, there are no benefits from drinking, only negatives. And yeah, the lowering of the recommended guideline, I think, was mainly on the basis of even low levels of alcohol consumption, increasing risk of cancer. I mean, those risks are pretty low. If you look at it from a sort of statistical perspective, drinking within the guidelines is very unlikely to, result in an alcohol-related cancer, but will in some small way be contributing to an increased risk. And obviously that's in combination with other lifestyle factors. So if you drink alcohol and smoke, there's a really nasty synergistic effect where the odds are much more than just doing either of those alone. Similarly with kind of having other poor health outcomes or issues like being overweight, etc. But I guess the kind of complicating factor is around the social benefits of alcohol, and also, what I will say is a very complicated but I think important aspect of my drinking to acknowledge is that it's, I don't drink wine just because I like the taste of it. There is actually, I do notice a mild relaxing effect, and I still have I far less struggle with anxiety, having done, I think, lots of psychotherapy and, having a fairly healthy, good lifestyle routine that involves exercise and bits of yoga and other stuff. But I still tend to have a bit of a background anxiety buzzing away that's very manageable and nothing like what it used to be, which was probably part of the driver of the attraction to drinking in the first place. But having a glass of wine will kind of dampen that out a bit. So there obviously is that sort of positive reinforcement effect that still attracts me to drinking alcohol in moderation. But in the moment, that feels pleasant, and it's a very complex debate, but you could argue that drinking in the moment within the guidelines, if it brings you some physiological benefits like increased relaxation, you can argue that's not a negative thing, that's a positive thing. But of course, it's a very complex trade-off between, not wanting to do that more often and then the health consequences associated with that.
And
So,
individualized, and very,
yeah,
very individualized, because you touched on something very important about, and that was the work. We'll call the work, which was you went to psychotherapy, you do the habits and the routines. So there's going to be a balance in between there, but we'll come on to that a bit later about what it is. So let's talk about this very specifically, because what you've painted a picture in my mind, just from this conversation so far, is that the idea of controlled drinking is to go from alcohol use disorder, which is a big, long stretch of a word,
absolutely,
which captures a lot of other words used out there, but alcohol use disorder kind of captures them, and then to bring them back down to below or at the guidelines. Is that how you would describe controlled drinking, or what would you describe as controlled drinking?
Yeah, I don't love the term controlled drinking, but historically it's the one that, beginning in the sort of 60s and 70s where the debates really started kicking off. But yeah, technically within most of the research literature, controlled drinking is defined as drinking within the recommended guidelines, although they've obviously shifted over the years. But there is a kind of a push amongst some and some good evidence to support drinking reduction goals as being important as well. So someone called Katie Vitkovits, who's an amazing alcohol researcher based in America, has done a lot of work where she kind of shows that even a drinking risk reduction, even from like a severe level of alcohol dependence to a moderate or less severe alcohol level of dependence, will result in really significant health improvements and quality of life functioning and so on. So I guess controlled drinking is defined as drinking within the guidelines, which is a very low risk level of alcohol. But we don't want to throw out the fact that, harm reduction of principles are still really important for other people who may not want abstinence or may not feel like they can achieve abstinence, that there's still lots of benefits from harm reduction or other types of reduction approaches. But the term controlled drinking, for me, implies that you're still needing to control it, and therefore you're still fundamentally addicted, and it's a problem. So for me, I prefer terms like mindful drinking, or just low risk drinking, or just drinking without a problem, for instance. But it's very complex.
Because mindful, I mean, if you mindful is also, I agree, but then mindful drinking is like, if you mindfully eat chocolate, it doesn't mean that you're eating a low amount of it. It just means that you're going, no, this is so tasty, and I'm getting fragrances. That was flavor and fragrances all in one word.
I get it.
Fragrances of South America, or blah blah blah. So it is fraught. This whole place, this whole thing that we do, you and I, of helping people and researching and trying to get the best science out there and stuff like that, is fraught with words to avoid. It's like potholes in the road. You're like, oh, avoid that one and avoid that one. Okay, so thank you for that understanding of controlled drinking. So my next question from that is, what studies have you seen? You've done a lot of research into this. What studies have you seen around controlled drinking and their success rates, and what was working in them?
Yeah, so in a couple of years ago, or 2022, there was a systematic review and meta-analysis of all the kind of controlled drinking studies. So
I've read that, thank you.
Yeah, so it's not a huge evidence base. There's not huge amounts of work that's gone into controlled drinking, but we do have a pretty consistent...
Still thousands?
Yes, thousands of participants across those studies. And we do have a pretty consistent, clear picture over what's now decades of research that for some people, absolutely it can work. The sort of parameters or kind of conditions around it are important. People with very severe alcohol use disorder tend not to be suitable for it, particularly because they tend to have severe liver damage, and therefore any amount of alcohol is going to be really high risk of kind of liver failure. And also severe, it's unclear the extent to which alcohol dependency is really associated with likelihood of succeeding in controlled drinking. It was historically thought that absolutely the more severe your alcohol use disorder, the less suitable controlled drinking outcome might be. And that makes a lot of sense. But the evidence isn't quite so clear on that. It does seem that there's even a proportion of people, a minority, probably less than 20% of people with more severe alcohol use disorder who do go on to achieve a controlled drinking goal. But in the general sense, they're more suitable for people that probably aren't going to need a detox and long period of structured treatment or suitable for a rehab. It's that kind of more general proportion of, functional alcohol dependent drinkers who are going to be more likely, the Adrian Chiles type person, someone like me, rather than someone that has had, a very severe long period of heavy alcohol dependence. And yeah, even then, there's still lots of other contingent aspects that, that predicted success. And a lot of people also start off with a controlled drinking goal and end up with an abstinence goal, and some vice versa.
Completely,
Yeah.
absolutely. One of the things that we've certainly found throughout our programs, when we first launched this, it was like, hey, this is just for lifestyle drinkers and social drinkers and binge drinkers. We're really not for this. And if you've got alcohol use disorder, don't sign up. And that's on our terms and conditions. It was, please read these before you sign up. Well, over the years, we've had thousands, a huge proportion. I don't want to publicly admit what the proportion is, but it's the vast proportion of people who are considered alcohol use disorder have come in and had huge success with our program. And I think there's an element of the sort of the treatment, the bucket you are putting somebody into. At the end of the day, looking at neuroscience, looking at science, psychology, all of those things, the brain is a wonderful thing, and we can change it. We can rebuild neural pathways. We can change our beliefs and our habits and our routines, and we can change these things, and we can recreate who we are about ourselves. We can unlock trauma. We can move past all this stuff. And so that means that we don't necessarily need to be something that we were before. We can change. And on that basis, I think if you can give people the right tools and you give the people the right structure and the right guidance, they can often achieve these things. So what I'd love to be a part of, and you and I think this is hopefully the beginning of a fruitful relationship together. Because what I'd love to be a part of is trying to demonstrate this with evidence and proof to saying to people, really that we can hone in and that we can help people self-identify, right? So in a very powerful scorecard, which is something we're working now, I can take a simple survey that is going to look at the various factors in my life and score those. Okay, we have the audit score right now, but it's way more multidimensionary than the audit score, right? It's way beyond that. I've talked for a while now. Any thoughts on what I've just said?
Yeah, absolutely. So Nick Heather, who was one of my PhD supervisors and one of the leading researchers into controlled drinking.
How I found you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. He actually developed something called the impaired control scale, and that was found to be quite useful as a predictor of a likelihood of a controlled drinking outcome. So I don't think it's widely utilised in practice, but I think sometimes it is kind of used where, someone who is kind of weighing up what kind of goal they might want to aim for might be offered an opportunity to go through that. I suppose, just taking a really kind of broad step back, for someone who's not engaging in treatment and trying to figure out on this on their own, I think the crux of it is really about, being honest about what role is alcohol playing in your life, how much of that is driving the kind of problem as you see it, and if you're going to kind of use alcohol in the future, you're almost certainly going to probably want or need or benefit from a period of abstinence to kind of reset in some sense. I don't mean literally necessarily in a sort of neuroscientific way, but there is definitely evidence, as you say, the brain's very plastic, and trimming back those pathways, those overlearned behaviours that make drinking kind of automatic is going to be definitely a big part of success in changing any behaviour, including alcohol use. But for me, I think that the most important way to really look at it from kind of an individual perspective is, what role do I want or expect alcohol to be playing in my life? And is that one that's going to be compatible with kind of managing it in the way that I'd like to? So for me, the peak of my problematic drinking was when, I was a teenager. I had a lot of sort of fire in my belly, a lot of sort of issues that I didn't, or emotions that I didn't really know how to control. And, and alcohol was really a way of kind of, I think, allowing me to feel like I was dealing with that stuff when I wasn't really. So yeah, doing the work, I think, was probably, and a long period of abstinence were the two things that really allowed me to put space between everything that had developed into an alcohol problem and how I can now use it in a way that means that I'm not using it in a way that's kind of as a coping response, or de-stressor, or a substitute for an identity, or any of those kind of things.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, of course, as well, is the way in which, you, as you mentioned, the term alcohol use disorder. Well, the dominance of the alcoholism model is so strong still. And, I'm not a critique of AA in the sense that it works for a lot of people who it works for, but it does present alcohol problems in a way that is incompatible with the idea of controlled drinking. If you self-identify as an alcoholic, the literal condition of that, according to sort of Alcoholics Anonymous, is that you admit powerlessness over alcohol and that you can't control your alcohol use. But I've argued that way of thinking about alcohol problems is saturated, is spilled over so much that for many people who can achieve controlled drinking, they're trying to make sense of changing their drinking in that kind of alcoholic or not binary. And yeah, so it's kind of, Alcoholics Anonymous, yes.
Word in your mouth.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Unhelpful, because I see that. I see people say, oh, I've slipped up again. I must remain alcohol-free forever because this is the only way, and I'm going to have to stay on the alcohol-free path. Yeah. No. You just haven't figured it out yet. You haven't been shown what you need to change. You don't know what the things are that are driving it, but you can.
Potentially, yeah. And I just really want to caveat it, though, by, of course, saying that abstinence, I think we both agree that for many people, abstinence is the better choice. And for those people, you can see why Alcoholics Anonymous appeals and does work. And of course, then there's a whole other set of arguments about some of the downsides or risks or consequences of Alcoholics Anonymous. But generally, a peer support network, all supporting other people with the same goal, is a valuable thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea of this sort of the alcoholic model was developed came about more prominently in the 1930s in America, and remains today as an unscientific binary categorization of alcoholics and everybody else. And as we've already discussed, it's so much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. One core factor here, just to put into perspective, our programs, once again, 1 year no beer, okay, that's abstinence. 28-day alcohol-free challenge, 90-day alcohol-free challenge. Even our controlled drinking programs, the complete control, that's a minimum of 30 days alcohol-free. Now, you're right, abstinence does not equal control, but the best way to get control is to have a period of abstinence and to do the work. Those two together. You said it perfectly. You said 8 years, that's a long time. Well done. But for you as well, it was a needle in a haystack. You didn't know what to look for. You were just trying to figure it out yourself, right? Meanwhile, studying psychology and learning these other things. So, that's exactly it. And I think, always, I think we must take the best possible care of people. For me, what I see is that people are afraid of abstinence, right? They're afraid of admitting they need abstinence. They're afraid they're ashamed. They're stigmatized. It's like, I don't want to go over there. I don't want to do that. I think I can try and control it myself. And they get stuck in a little loop of trying to control and often make things worse, right? But what we say to people is, hey, we can help you control your drinking, right? We're going to help you control your drinking. Come over here. Great, I come over the line. Right, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get you to stop drinking for 30 days, right? I had Dopamine Nation, wonderful lady. I just had her on the podcast, and she's showing what's happening from a neuroscience perspective that, in a 28-day period, the reward pathway is reset from a dopamine perspective, right? So that element allows your reward pathway to reset, which I think is really, really powerful for people. So I just want to touch in on again about your research, okay? The research you were showing about people not getting help because of the abstinence study programs, you kind of touched onto that, and why, without putting words in your mouth, why you think we can help more people if we are sort of focusing on the control element.
Yeah, so the control element's one part of it, but I could say just, again, more broadly, it's about reconceptualizing society's understanding of alcohol use and problems, and particularly what I have researched, through experimental studies where we kind of tweak people's beliefs, is to kind of really prime them with this idea of alcohol problems existing on a continuum. And that really is a direct counter to what I was saying about that problem of the dichotomy, the binary between alcoholics and everybody else. Yeah. And we're cognitively biased towards reductionist. We want to, is that we're very strongly motivated just instinctively to try and put things into boxes and make sense of the world by making it more digestible, and less nuanced is easier to just understand. And we need to do that to go about our daily lives. If we saw everything in its entire complexity, we wouldn't get anywhere or get anything done. But for certain things or thought processes, that can be problematic. And certainly in terms of, as you're saying, people thinking about, if I've got an alcohol problem, does that mean I need to give up alcohol altogether and attend AA for the rest of my life? Well, understandably, that's a very scary prospect for a lot of people, particularly people that do maybe have social networks or are very aware of the benefits that they have. So, there's good research, lots of research showing that there's a large group of people who drink at heavy levels, have levels of alcohol use disorder, maybe not at the more severe end of the spectrum, but when you talk to them, they're very protective about the benefits and the value that they get from drinking, and very keen to disassociate themselves from the stigma of being an alcoholic. That's understandably very threatening to, be aware of. If you have that label attached to you, that other people see you differently. They'll discriminate against you, and they will see you as in some way biologically deficient or dangerous or unreliable. The stigma attached to being seen as having an alcohol problem is really surprisingly high. You can compare it to illegal drugs and severe mental health conditions, which have very high stigma. Alcohol problems, once you're in that category, the stigma is just as high. But it's in part driven by lots of people who drink heavily who are actually going, well, that's not us. Look at the, in inverted commas, alcoholics. Those are the problem drinkers. So society is lots of heavy drinkers are unintentionally increasing stigma by creating that false separation into two groups. I mean, in sort of sociology, we call it othering, and it happens in lots of different ways. So people will, with mental health problems, say, oh no, it's schizophrenics who are the problem, and create that extreme stereotype of an other to protect and distance themselves from. So most of my research is about how can we increase understanding of alcohol use and problems as a broad spectrum, to challenge that othering, to challenge that false dichotomy that will help hopefully reduce the stigma and help people recognise that, there are different pathways and different routes to recovery or controlling your drinking or whatever, that it's not this black and white thing of if you have a problem, you need to give up and go to AA and there's no other way to it. No beer and all the other kind of options and narratives that are emerging around positive sobriety and young people, I think, are sort of organic response to that kind of oversimplification that's kind of spilled over and that we're kind of trying to lay back on a bit.
One thing you mentioned quite some back ago is you said that you used the word relapse right now. So talking about the word relapse, and that is a measure in the alcohol use disorder success rates for abstinence-based programs, relapse. What's the measure for controlled drinking?
Well, yeah, that's a
Does
tough
relapse
question.
exist? Is it that here you were before, you were drinking 100 plus units, and then we'll take a bunch of people through a program, and then those of you who are back at the 100, the program hasn't worked. Is that how they're measuring it, or how are they measuring it?
Well, it depends in different studies. I think in most outcomes would look at, what your number of units per week is, what your audit score is, how many heavy drinking days you've had, and then sort of average those out to establish a level of, in most programs you'll see significant reductions in all of those in both people aiming for abstinence and controlled drinking. So, the Hensler systematic review showed that his conclusion was basically whether people are aiming for abstinence or whether they're aiming for controlled drinking, the outcomes are basically the same. Like, both groups improve in the sense that not everyone who's aiming for abstinence achieves abstinence. They have lapses, as do people who are aiming for controlled drinking. There's no significant difference in terms of the improvements or outcomes between those two groups. But yeah, the term relapse, is controversial because, it is potentially stigmatizing. If you say someone has had a relapse, it sounds quite judgmental. It infers that they've kind of lost control and, they're all the way back to the start. So yeah, I think, a lot of people say lapse is a very normal part of recovery for almost any addictive behavior or health behavior.
Yeah.
Almost no one just does it on the first go. It's a process, and obviously that's a big part of addiction, is that because it's so complicated and it's so such an embedded and problematic or difficult behavior to change, that really it is a process. And it's commonly cited that it's not until kind of 5 years of being sort of in recovery, in inverted commas, that the chance of returning to pre-recovery levels of drinking is reduced to kind of a really kind of 15% or less risk. So the risk of or the chance of, in inverted commas, relapse remains high for several years after recovery begins, but gradually will reduce over time. But it's a long process.
Yeah. I had a participant once who came onto the program, and he helped me solidify this analogy. So, we have on the wagon, off the wagon. But let's bring that up to today. So controlled drinking is like rally driving. Okay, now it's like a rear-wheel car rally drive, which is that you are almost always on the edge of control. Okay, you're on the edge of control with controlled drinking. Sometimes bring it back on, sometimes bring it back off, but it's the test of learning as you go through that journey. On that point, and please don't be offended, but from what I'm trying to do, or what we are trying to do in our controlled drinking programs, and where I think the sweet spot and what is actually healthy and okay, to me, your level of drinking is too much, right? That I believe that where it should be for people to be in controlled drinking is actually most of the time they don't drink, because even just 2 drinks, it's going to disturb your sleep. It's going to impact your work. It's going, it does. We're actually seeing more and more from the science that just a low amount of alcohol does impact us. Cool. And what we say in our program is really that peak performance and drinking alcohol regularly cannot coexist.
Sure.
So if you want this, then we can't be here. But I agree with you also in the same sentence about the benefits and the perceived benefits and taking edge off and things like that. And as society, I think we need to do more to have something more prevalent that's less harmful that people can help take the edge off. Maybe that's CBD-infused beer.
Sure.
Another story. Sorry, I've gone on a little bit of a warpath there, but...
Can I come back on it? I mean,
yep.
The idea of something being too much or whatever, and the idea of addiction
subjective.
Obviously is subjective. But I would certainly accept that, if I have 2 glasses of wine with a meal, which I will sometimes do, that I know that if I haven't had a few hours before I go to bed, after having the last glass or finished the glass of wine, that it will definitely negatively affect my sleep. But that there's even evidence that small amounts of alcohol will negatively affect cognitive performance, memory functioning, reaction times, etc. the next day. So yeah, I don't deny that the level of drinking that I have has some negative consequences. But what I would say, and you can apply this to the context of any individual's person, any individual in the context of their a whole range of different behaviours, whether it's addiction or health behaviour, diet or exercise, is that, you kind of make value-based decisions on all of these things. And obviously the more informed, the better that is. But for me, yeah, it's not too much, because I'm weighing up, I think, from a fairly informed position, all those benefits and consequences. And yeah, sometimes I think, oh, actually, it did disturb my sleep a bit and I wish I'd had either nothing or one at all. But what I would really agree on is that absolutely less is more, particularly if you're looking at those physiological and general functional benefits. If you're really looking to maximize your cognitive and physical performance and all those kind of things, then absolutely less is more and none is better than less. But to balance it in the context of, I love cooking. I'm a big foodie, to use a sort of cliched term, and therefore wine and food can be an amazing thing. So if it's affecting my cognitive performance by 5 or 10% the next day, that's a trade-off I'm kind of happy to take. But yeah, it's not clear-cut. It's very complex.
So thank you for that clarity there. And I guess what I wanted to say was, for you, right? Rather than the judgment of, because I'm not here to judge at all, right?
Okay.
And like you said, most importantly, subjective, okay? So if you could get somebody from a very, very high or high level of drinking, alcohol use disorder, down to being able to control their drinking within the lower risky limits, that's a huge success. And that's amazing. That is what we should be aiming to do and strive for. The part of me is like, that because we see this trade-off in this part, that really the best place for somebody is not really drinking that often. But that being said, I drink, right? I reckon I was thinking about that while you were talking, probably the 14 units this year. Maybe a bit more, maybe 20 units. So really, really not much. I just tend not to drink. But if I think about all of our participants who've been through the Complete Control program, there'll be very varying levels. But again, it comes back to this self-reported part where they're saying, no, I'm drinking in control. But they might be having a binge fest once a month, but it's down from doing it once a week. That's a huge success. Well done. Okay. I said we weren't going to make this all about you, and it's been quite a lot talking about your personal relationship with alcohol, but it is fascinating. I think the big thing in here is about you doing it with the most amount of research and evidence and knowledge that you have, having specialized in this field. So amazing. We have sort of touched on the work. Okay, and I want to talk about that because I have some pretty strong ideas about what the work is, and I know we kind of pinged backwards and forwards about this. What's the work? What have you done, and that's enabled you to get to this place? And what's the work that you now see that people need to do?
Well, again, that's hugely subjective, but I do have, as a sort of research psychologist, I do have a pretty strong psychological view on the human condition, that we all have lived experiences that strongly shape who we are and how we interact with the world. And, I still think that there's a lot of value to sort of psychodynamic understandings, that an attachment theory is hugely influential for understandable reasons, that our childhood experiences and bonds are formative in terms of how we form and carry out relationships throughout our lives, and that we're relational beings, that our social connections are fundamental to who we are. And all the evidence shows that it's very hard to be a happy, healthy, functioning person without a decent degree of kind of social relationships in our lives. But yeah, the work for me, I think, was, a kind of fairly long process so I kind of did regular psychotherapy for about 6 years. And, my parents separated when I was 2. My mum got legal custody of me. They were in a long kind of protracted, difficult period of fighting each other, for who would see me when. And, I still to this day am not a fan of Christmas because it reminds me of the kind of difficult times that, that was when it would really kick off, and
oh dear,
they'd fight over, who I'd spend time with. And so, there was various consequences as a result of that. I spent a period of time when I was 7, where I went to boarding school, and, at that time, I think I felt a bit like I was just sent away. So, those are some of the things that, it's not a kind of, I don't want to portray it as a sort of victim narrative, but I think those things did shape and affect me. By the time I became a teenager, I had a lot of stuff that I wasn't really aware of, but I didn't really know how to deal with. And that ultimately was what made alcohol particularly attractive, in a sense that it felt like it offered some release, but also a way of being someone that would sort of stand up for myself or say what I wanted to say when I'd sort of internalized or felt unable to do that for quite a long time. So the work for me was just a process of firstly recognizing the things that had happened and how they kind of affected me, and then being able to process it and understand how it affected me in my day-to-day life. And a lot of those things are positive as well. I had lots of positive childhood experiences as well, and it wasn't all bad, but just understanding the good and the bad in terms of how that functions in my life, including my use of alcohol or other things that might make me feel good, either on a short or longer term basis, is what the work is for me. And then that needs to be balanced as well by looking after myself, by exercising regularly.
Habits and routines.
Exactly. Yep. All the stuff that your program helps people with.
So the habits and routines, touch on that. What did you discover there? What did you start implementing? What do you do?
So for me, it's kind of quite a broad mixture of things that some of it might come under sort of a mindfulness banner. So I do enjoy yoga. I do enjoy running. Well, I don't enjoy running. I enjoy the feeling of having done a good run. And I probably enjoy the gym a bit more. I really enjoy golf. Again, that's partly the social element of it, and but also just the sort of aspect of trying to get better at it, and hitting a good shot is rewarding. And then to sort of the broader everyday stuff that everyone enjoys, being outside, seeing friends, reading, learning stuff, cooking, those kind of things. So I kind of prioritize, and then sleep's really important as well. There's a really strong link between history of experience with alcohol use disorder and poor sleep. So sleep is something that I absolutely prioritize. Anyone who knows me knows me. I'm not a morning person, and come alive at night a bit more.
Yeah, amazing. So we talked about those. I mean, those are sort of the key elements for us. The pay to play. So what do we say is if you want to perform at a high level, and then you're going to have a high level of stress. Okay. Now that stress is countered by doing these things, and these are like permission to play, like yoga, meditation, sleep, exercise, is really permission to play at a high level. Because if you are not doing those things, then you're so likely to have compulsive behavior. Your system won't work. Your central nervous system is going to be constantly spiked, and so that is people in fight or flight. And when you add in that trauma element, past trauma. You talk about it saying, well, you think it will, okay, I am less balanced than a scientific researcher. I'm quite opinionated. So I don't have to be so fluffy around the edges as you do. Not that is saying that you are. That's not the right word. The more, what would you describe it as? How do you have to be as a scientist? You have to be...
Cautious.
Thank you. Cautious. and
Hedge your bets a bit.
diplomatic.
Yeah.
And diplomatic to other research. No, because I'm a big advocate of the work of Gabor Mate. In fact, we should be getting him on the podcast for this series, really looking into epigenetics and what's happened from an early age and in embryo and during the pregnancy and all of those things. It's really, really fascinating. And I think that is, by going down the psychotherapy route and starting to talk about these things and learn, some of it we're conscious of, some of it we aren't, but it all adds into the work. Something else we talked about before was impulsivity, and the link of impulsivity. Is that in his scale was called the impaired control scale? Is impulsivity a factor in that?
Can't remember if it's a factor in the scale, but it probably is, or some components of it. Certainly. Like a really important thing in recovery or kind of recovery outcomes is self-efficacy. So we know that the belief in your ability to perform a behaviour is highly influential on how successful you'll be in doing that. So we know that people who are struggling with alcohol problems have very low self-belief in their ability to control their drinking, whereas people who are, succeeding at recovery, what we've seen is a huge rise in self-efficacy. So self-efficacy tends to come from successfully performing the action. And learning, finding ways to manage things that might be results of impulsivity. So giving into kind of cravings or triggers, and that's, in a large part why CBT-based approaches are effective, because they help us to identify thoughts that might lead to often an impulsive response, mediated by a sort of feeling of anxiety or whatever, and put in place those kind of protective behavioural strategies. So high impulsivity is a trait that's associated with addiction, but it's very hard to kind of tease out the exact role and to cause and effect and so on. So, and then the danger of sort of believing, oh, I'm an impulsive person or I have an addictive personality, those things can become self-fulfilling, whereas actually, people often say, I'm just terrible at maths, I couldn't ever do it. I used to believe that until I did statistics from my PhD, which I could no longer avoid, having avoided it for my whole life. But I realised with hindsight that what I actually needed was just to invest some time in taking it on and learning how to do it, and not being a kind of slave to the belief that I can't do it. And I think, things like impulsivity or compulsion or, weak will or addictive personalities can be quite dangerous ideas, because they can undermine self-efficacy, whereas all the research shows that it's building people's confidence, particularly by acting out or putting these things into practice, that really determine success.
And this is why positive psychology is so helpful, because it's a framework for that, can be.
There's the cautious optimism.
We're steeped in positive psychology over here. Because it's aspirational, it's focused on moving forward, and all of those wonderful things. So I think that's another tick to that. We're coming to the end. I want to ask you a couple of questions. What do you think is the biggest barrier to us helping more people change their relationship with alcohol at the moment?
I still think it's just the kind of cultural normalization of both kind of alcohol use as just a sort of normal thing, and then alcohol problems being this kind of very extreme end of what is actually a very long and broad nuanced spectrum. There's still a lot of really important policy stuff that needs to happen. We know minimum pricing does work, and there's been huge. Labelling is important. I mean, it's probably not hugely influential in terms of individual decision making, but I think it's in principle really important to give people informed choices about how many units they're drinking and what kind of calories are in.
I'm talking about pictures of dead lungs on cigarettes. Did that work?
I mean, I've done some research around this, and it tends not to work for the people that it's most important to work for. So, there's much more research around this in terms of the tobacco, scary, scary pictures. But what tends to happen is there's something called defensive processing or attention avoidance, where subconsciously we just divert our attention away from things that make us feel uncomfortable, particularly where self-efficacy is low. So if you're a heavily addicted smoker and you believe you can't change your smoking, your mind will be really effective at blocking out anything that reminds you how scary smoking is. So I've done some research around this, and we find the same effect, that the more of an alcohol problem someone has and the lower their self-efficacy is, the more they use these subconscious processes to look away. So I think it's important that we give people accurate information, but we can't rely on, individual messages that promote health behavior change. I mean, it's not a coincidence that DrinkAware is the alcohol industry's main response to how we address the problems with alcohol, and the rest of the alcohol, or most of the alcohol industry, are heavily opposed to pricing, advertising and availability curbs, because those are the really important ones for the sort of policy levers that will reduce alcohol consumption, particularly amongst heavy drinkers. But again, it is complicated, and it's not there's no magic bullets. We need sort of bottom up and top down approaches, but definitely that sort of changing that cultural normalization of alcohol use has to come from treating it more as a drug that needs to be regulated, rather than just an ordinary commodity.
Amazing. So what if you could bring all of the stakeholders into the room, and I'm left that deliberately open, every stakeholder into the room, whether that's the individual who needs support, the companies involved, the manufacturers, the policy, drugs, alcohol, reviewers, the licensee holders, everyone. If you could get all of the people into the room and they were waiting on your decision, or what to say next, what action would you take to make a global difference? What steps, what things would you implement?
Cool, yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I would definitely say that I think the evidence is that if we have a floor price, a minimum unit price, that means alcohol can't be bought for very cheap money, so that people can use it as a heavy intoxicating drug in the way that it often is. That it's harder to obtain large amounts of the drug component of it for less amounts of money. I definitely think we need to really rein in advertising. Despite the kind of voluntary code, we know that children recognize alcohol brands, they value them positively, they think it's a normal part of kind of growing up and so on. But then just my own thing would be much more about just changing the language. Outside of Alcoholics Anonymous, we shouldn't use the term alcoholism. It's so embedded within this reductionist binary idea and all the negative stereotypes that people portray onto people, associated with this idea of rock bottom. So, alcohol use disorder isn't a perfect term. Alcohol problems has some problems with it, if you want to dissect it as well. But the more nuanced we can be, and the more we can recognize the individual nature and the nuanced nature and the context of it and people's lived experiences, then the better we can kind of move away from sort of pathologizing, othering ideas that alcohol problems are just one group of people who need abstinence and the rest of us are all fine, because it really is a very broad spectrum, as we've really discussed.
Amazing. Okay, well, some good thoughts. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing, James. I would love you to come and have a look at some of the data and evidence that we're gathering.
Ooh.
Maybe we can do something together, get something published. I want to prove some of the model. I want to prove some of the things that we're doing. I've talked to you about that before. I'm now stating it out on the podcast here. We've worked with Stirling University in the past. We published things on our program and model. We're here to help a lot of people, and we're on the same mission. My answer to that point would be, to the same question, would be, I reckon, something along the lines of we've got to the behemoths in the room are the alcohol companies. They're lobbying, they're paying against, they're stopping. Those are the big juggernauts. So if we can steer them in the right direction, I think that alcohol as a drug is a really, really, really shit drug. But I also understand societies need to take the edge off. And I think there's far better drugs out there. And I think we could help the alcohol companies research and develop better substance that's less harmful, that can help people just take the edge off. So I reckon I'd be subsidizing R&D into alternative. I'd be trying to steer the alcohol companies away, massively increasing tax and restricting advertising, really force those alcohol companies to come up with the next version, because there is work going on in there, but it's paying homage a lot. It's like, Drinkaware, which was like come on, it's not really here changing the world's relationship with alcohol. So if we can get them aligned and really motivated to do it, then I think that would force some change. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'd agree with some of that. So obviously there are kind of alternative alcohol
coming
substitutes that are sort of in development, but yeah, I'm not a kind of neuropsychopharmacologist, so I can't speak too much to all of that. But I agree that there has to be other options that help people to be less reliant on alcohol for taking the edge off. And you can really zoom out and say we need to make society more equal and more opportunities and kind of all of that stuff. And then within the context of, how we kind of adjust alcohol's position as a drug, there's definitely work to be done. And I think for all drugs, it's a balance of regulation. If you go too far, you have negative effects like we saw with prohibition driving underground markets. So prohibition did work in some ways, but it just obviously had negative consequences as well. So I think it's really hard. There's no perfect balance of regulation for any drug or commodity, but definitely at the moment it's under-regulated in that it's over-available, it's too cheap, and it's too widely advertised without kind of curbs on what enough curbs on what that advertising can really do. So it's a complicated one, and I'd agree to a large part.
What's next for you?
So as a kind of academic trying to maintain a kind of research focus, it's about putting in grants and trying to bring in money to develop kind of more research programs. So I'm really interested in how we can reduce the stigma around alcohol problems, primarily via changing that kind of narrative and understanding so that we have more nuanced understanding. Also how changing mindsets and beliefs about alcohol can increase problem recognition and help seeking, whether that's through apps or through formal treatment for people with more severe dependence. I have a podcast, the Alcohol Problem Podcast, where
Fantastic.
We touch on various different issues. Kind of more of that stuff. I obviously love it and enjoy it, and hope I can continue to work in this field.
Good man. And so where do people find out more about you? Mention the podcast one more time, and anywhere else. Go, hit it.
Sure. So the Alcohol Problem Podcast is on all the podcast players. And I'm on Twitter as James Morris 24. Those are probably my most outward or public facing kind of points. And I'm always happy to debate or answer questions.
Good man. Keep doing what you're doing, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's been a really great chat. Brilliant questions. Thanks, Rory.
Thank you.